Change. At this time, Elder Eugene Williams is coming to give us an introduction on our speaker, Dr. Wade Nobles.
We decided a few weeks ago, and the decision had been building for quite some time, that New Covenant Presbyterian Church was making a conscious decision to develop an African-centered thought and practice to everything that we do. It is extremely difficult as we struggle through a system that does not necessarily understand, appreciate, nor want the contributions of African Americans. It is extremely difficult for us to struggle with that. Under the direction of our pastor, we have made a conscious decision that no longer will we scratch when it doesn't itch, laugh when it's not funny, hold back who we are. And we know that the foundation of change has to start with our young people. Last year we started a series of cultural programs, and I taught a two-part series on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This year we will start out with a discussion about the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. The aim of these presentations is not just to talk about history, but it is to give us a political analysis of some of the struggles that we're facing here in this country. Young people, this is for you today. It is the reason why we have concentrated all of our efforts to get you here. We understand that some of our elders may not be able to carry on this struggle, but if you remember when we discussed SNCC last year, one of the things we talked about was the fact that Bob Moses and a whole series of young people were able to energize rural African Americans, and the elders rallied around them because they believed that the young people would really present them with an opportunity for change, because there was no fear in the hearts of young people. If you remember that day, we had a discussion about some of the problems that you all are facing in the high schools and the junior high schools. And I believe at that time I passed a pledge, both publicly and privately, that we want to begin to deal with these issues. Over the course of the summer, I was gone for quite a while to the West Coast, to Florida, Georgia, looking at some of the things that other young people are doing. And I have to admit to you that in no place did I find anything that was going on that could top what we're doing here at New Covenant. Your dedication to this church, your dedication to the struggles of African American people will become more significant as we go along. Last night we had a good lecture by our speaker, and I must admit that for me, early on, and I've admitted this many times in discussions, I was drawn to the spirit of our pastor and to the spirit of our young people, but I asked myself the question, how could we reconcile being Presbyterian in this day and time? And there was an elder by the name of John Henry Clark who talked about the fact that there was a Presbyterian minister by the name of Edward Wilmot Blyden who did significant things to uplift our people. Many times you've heard me testify about Henry Highland Garnett. So how I wrestle with being Presbyterian is in the spirit of those two individuals. And that also has something to do with the cultural component that we're dealing with. Because if we don't see ourselves in Scripture, if we don't see ourselves in the textbooks, if we don't see ourselves in positions of rulership, then we continue to think that we have to be like someone other than ourselves to succeed. All of you all know very well how we've been wrestling with the fact that our pastor preaches from an African American tradition, that our elders tend to want to deal strictly with an African American position. And we've asked the question no later than yesterday, if not now, when? If not us, who? So I think it's very, very important to put today in the context of that. Our first speaker is someone that I've become very, very familiar with over the course of the past 2 years. And you've heard me time and time again talk about the need for us to develop study groups, to not just study Scripture per se, but to get behind it. And right after a discussion with the pastor about a year ago, our speaker, I attended a conference with the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. And he made the point that it was not just what was on the surface, but what was behind all of that that really told us who we are. And he used the analogy of a brother that may be talking to a sister on the corner and talking real slick, and then he said, but the sister asked, what are you really about? It is another example he talked about is when young men came into someone's house to date their daughter, and the parents would ask the metaphysical question, whose are you? Because I can't trust you, but I can judge your character by that who raised you. And it is why we lifted up the verse from Proverbs, that if you train up and raise up a child right, they'll never depart from you. Elijah Muhammad once said that if you can prescribe the diameter of a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about the radius of his actions. Our aim, the aim of the speaker, is to prescribe to you a new way of thinking about being African. As I said last night, that he is a general in a movement that's picking up steam every day. It is a movement that young people, you are going to have to carry on. And again, today we're not looking for information, we're looking for intelligence. There's a big difference. Information is something that you just process and you have. Intelligence is something that you can use and work with. I like to present to some, introduce to others, a brother who I feel very, very strongly about. I ask us to open up our hearts and minds, and I'd like to present to you Dr. Wade Nobles.
I'd like to thank Brother Eugene for giving me an opportunity to speak to members of our tribe that live here in Philadelphia, and to begin my comments about, I want to talk about youth development, manhood training particularly, and our responsibility in terms of raising up the next generation of African people. And before I do that, I have to begin, as I did last night, and as I always do, by beginning my comments in recognition of the responsibilities of elders. And I want to do that by, if I may, my brother, I want to ask you to serve as black male eldership, and I'm going to formally ask you if I have your permission to speak. Thank you. And I do that especially today because of the young people in the audience, and I want them to recognize that even though, we may be psychologist this or leader that or important person whatever, we all have a responsibility to submit to the guidance of eldership. And elders have the responsibility of protecting our community from the worst form of disease, which is ignorance, particularly ignorance of self. And so by asking elder if I have permission to speak, I am giving elder in this community that responsibility of guaranteeing that they should know what I have to say. And if I say something stupid, or if I've said something stupid in the past, they would be able to tell me, no, you cannot speak. And then I would simply ask eldership, what is it that I have failed to learn so that I can go and learn it and thereby be of better service to my community. But it is with my elders' permission, I now ask all of you to allow me to assume a posture of reverence and respect while I give praise and credit to the source of all knowledge and all truth. And I do that by saying out loud that the Almighty, who is sometimes called Amun, and is sometimes called Aset, and is sometimes called Ptah, and is sometimes called Seshat, and is sometimes called Jehovah, and is sometimes called Obatula, and is sometimes called the Christ, and is sometimes called Oshun, and is sometimes called Shango, and is sometimes called Allah, and it is sometimes called Oya, and it is sometimes called Olodumare, and it is sometimes called Atum, that Almighty God, Amun, Ptah, Ra, although hidden, is the source of all knowledge, all truth, and all wisdom. And I pray in what I share with you this morning that Amun Tehuti Orumila will be satisfied. Again, it is important for me to try to teach. And in teaching, I want the young people to recognize that what I've done is to provide the name or the praise names that African people have used across time for the Almighty. And that oftentimes we end up fighting wars about what is religion. And in the African tradition, it's never been about what is religion, but it's been about celebrating the spirit of our being, and that spirit of our being manifesting itself in our behavior. So it's important that we recognize some truisms that sometimes we forget. The first truism is that every process ends in a product, even though the process never ends. And so as we talk about developing, raising up, training, educating our young people, we should see that as a process of development. But more importantly, we should know what is the product that we want to create. Because the drive of process without a vision of the product is to engage in activity that has no direction or vision. And so it is important that we talk about the product, and it is clear, and I'm assuming that it is clear in this body, that the product we're talking about raising up and training and developing is African men and women. Now that doesn't mean that we're talking about sending people back to Africa. It means that we are always going to be African, and wherever we find ourselves, whether it be Philadelphia or Oakland or Alabama or Brazil or Cairo or Ghana or Oshun, wherever we find ourselves, we're African people. And it's in the context of those various places that we make decisions about what we're going to do as African people. The other axiom that I think is equally important is the recognition that the experiences of one generation become the history of the next generation, and the history of several generations become the traditions of a people. Now the reason why that's important is because what we do today becomes the history of the next generation. And if we continue to do the same thing over and over again, that becomes our tradition. Now, if we look and see what our communities are like, we can ask the question, do we want those kinds of things, the drive-bys, the crack cocaine, the inappropriate sexual behavior, the disrespect of men towards women and women towards men, do we want that to become the traditions of African people? If we do not, and I think I'm not guessing here, we do not. If we do not, then we have to begin talking about how do we change the experiences of African people so that our history is different, and then our history becomes the tradition of our people. I believe the way we change that is to focus on the development of the next generation and to challenge ourselves with how do we create an experience of young people that results in the kind of African men and women we want. That's a difficult task. It's a difficult task because we have to engage in intelligence, as Brother Eugene talks about, that sometimes we're not accustomed to dealing with. We have to engage in areas of study that sometimes we're not comfortable with or having experience in dealing with. We have to begin to contemplate and to work in study groups and discussion and discourse that allows us to think about things. But we have to do that in an area that hasn't been contaminated. And this is an important point. A lot of the information we have about African people has been contaminated, meaning filtered through non-African people to reflect who they are and not to say anything about what African people are. So we have to begin to try to find that area, that point where we have information that represents who we are. And I suggest, in looking at my own work as a psychologist, that while we talk about psychology and being important to human development, and we talk about philosophy as being important to understanding the meaning of what is to be human, ultimately the area we have to start in is not psychology or philosophy, it is theology. It is theology in the context that theology has to do with the rational study of the being of God. It is not the sanctified rituals that we do in Presbyterian church versus Baptist church versus Catholic church versus the Mosque of Islam or the Temple of Judaism. It is really talking about the rational study of the being of God. And in the African tradition, interestingly enough, when you talk about the being of God, you're talking about us. You're talking about people, because the being of God is that people represent the manifestation of the God force. Now, dealing with that becomes sometimes frightening because of our indoctrinations in terms of our own embracing a particular religious tradition. But theology becomes important because of that rational study, but it is more important because the theology of a community, if you will, the theology of African people, assumes the truth of itself by locating it at the moment of those people's beginning. What that says is that our African theology, and thereby philosophy and ultimately psychology, assumes the truth of its reality at the moment that African people were born. Now, when were African people born? Was it during slavery? Was it during the quest for educational excellence in Timbuktu and Mali and Ghana and Songhai? Our children should know what those moments are about. But I would offer to you and suggest to you that the moment of our beginning was the time before there was time. It was the time before there was time, and that is the time when we weren't contaminated with European ideas about black inferiority and about the inability and the negativity of African people. It is that moment that we see now in our researches and our studies that Africans begin to talk about divine law. Now, it is this divine law that is important for us as we talk about it. I hope you can appreciate that. I'm not starting out saying, here's the 5 things you need to teach young boys to be African men, or here are the 10 things you need to teach young girls how to be African women, but rather setting the foundation in the context in which our development must occur. It is not enough. We can't have these sort of Dr. Spock prescriptions about how you raise a black child. You have to understand the nature of our beingness as African people, and then influence the process so that the product that comes out of that process is in fact ours. And our ancestors 40,000 years ago, and I point that marker because it is good for young people when, at those moments when you begin to think you want to identify with somebody else and think that the Asians are better than us, or the Europeans are better than us, or some other folk are better than us, just locate where they were 40,000 years ago. And if you can find a people that were doing what we were doing 40,000 years ago, then follow them. But if you can't find a people, then at least look at your own path, your own footsteps in history, and follow those. And 40,000 years ago, our ancestors begin to talk about theology as the study of God's being, and that the community every community must continue to attempt to define for its generation its reason for being in the world. That's an important question. what is your reason for being in the world? African people have to answer that question. What is our reasons, particularly African American people, because of our history of oppression and distortion and miseducation, have to ask the question, what is our reason for being in the world? It's found in divine law. The African divine law, and you can look at various African philosophies, but they all translate to the same thing. The African divine law says that the divine law is simply to be, that humans be, and that in being we are the creative cause which makes us divine. Now that sounds sort of philosophical, but maybe even doesn't make sense to some folk. But what it essentially says is that if you don't be, it don't be. That if you don't be, nothing else occurs. And so in the being, you have a responsibility to determine what happens to you. We can't be passive victims of whatever happens to us and say, oh, someone did this to me and that's why I'm in this condition. Oh, I didn't get this, that's why I'm failing in this condition. No, the African way says that because since we be, then we are the creative cause of our condition. The only time we accept conditions that are less good for us is when we think that other folk are the creative cause. No, the African way says we are the creative cause. And in divine law, it is determined that every divine law has a moral mandate, and the moral mandate for African people is that if you be, you must become more better. You must become more better. That it is being more better that determines our process. If you look at what we do and how we do it as African people, all the things that we've done have always been challenged by this desire to be more better. The way your mama raised you, the way your grandfather raised you, the way your folk related to black children was really about being more better. That you can do more better than what you've done. That you don't have to accept this relationship. I mean, the fact that we went through 400 years of physical bondage and came out being able to establish universities. I mean, just think about that one fact, that black people were in bondage for 400 years, made illegal and sometimes even killed when we attempted to learn to read. And then as soon as we had physical emancipation, the three things that we created or recreated was the family. Men and women walked all over this country trying to find their wife, their child, their mama, their brother, to recreate family. We recreated the school, and we recreated the church. The church, the school, the family are the three pillars that we felt institutionally were important for us to be more better. That we didn't have those three things, theology, education, and family, we couldn't be more better. And so and that was a miracle in itself. How could people who were destroyed, who were killed, who were brutalized, who were taught that we were less than human, that we were in fact animals, immediately invent historical black colleges, begin to talk about education, and begin to develop men and women who were scientists, and who were philosophers, and who were architects, and who were doctors, and who were minds that were so brilliant in terms of the legal area that everyone else in the United States follows our legal prescriptions relative to issues of freedom and liberty in this country. We couldn't do that if we didn't have a moral mandate that spoke to the issue of being more better, the issue of becoming more better. And what we see in this theology and in this development of the next generation is that every cycle of major religious pronouncement is really a refinement. It is not Christians are right and the Muslims are wrong, or the Muslims are right and the Jews are wrong, or the Orthodox Western religions are right and the traditional African religions are wrong. It isn't that at all. Our tradition has always been to refine based upon where we are. And you see this in ancient Kemetic studies, that the theology of the first conceptions of the God force that happened in ancient Memphis talked about the creative principle being the unification. That the creative cause unifies things, doesn't divide them, doesn't separate them, doesn't destroy them, and that in fact in Ahamenes, a black man stands up and because of the theology begins to unify north and south regions of ancient Egypt. So you see, it's the political educational practice was consistent with the theological understanding of who we are. That's why you have the Presbyterian Church of old, seeing that it is not just praying to God and going on to heaven, but we must do something in our here and now in order to make a difference so that our children will be more better. You see later in ancient Kemet, in the city of Heliopolis, the same principle of God force translates now to not unification, but self-generation. That every people, every community has a responsibility to regenerate itself. What that means in very practical terms is that as we look at the next generation, these young people here in this chapel, we have to ask, are we engaging in a process that reproduces and refines them as a representative of who we are? That our children should not grow up looking in the mirror and hating what they see. Our children should not grow up believing that they need to cut off their noses and cut their lips off. And even though they're highly talented and the world sees them as a musical genius, think that they have to distort their physical features in order to be accepted by the world. We're not reproducing, refining the best of ourselves when our children think that they need to be, look like, act like, walk like, talk like, be like someone else. We have to see these things as part of the process. Self-generation and Hermophilus. Still, thousands of years later, Africans begin to talk about the creative principle, that creative cause being the principle of unicity. Again, that we are unified. That explains why in our traditions, the movements of African people, from Marcus Garvey's UNIA to the NAACPA to the Urban League to all the movements, civil rights movements of this country, weren't talking about just getting some material piece of the pie. They were talking about how aberrant, how vulgar it is when one people separate themselves and try to segregate another group of people based upon their race or their color. That was abhorrent to us, that was vulgar to us, and that we should fight and rally against that. It was driven by these same principles: self-generation, unification, unicity. So we have a long history of principles that really reflect our behavior, and that we can then go back and take and talk about how do we use these same principles to reproduce and refine the next generation of our community, and those are our children. That then suggests that our youth development programs, our manhood training programs, our womanhood training programs have to be centered in our culture. We cannot go and find Dr. Spock's book and read on page 13 what it is to do to provide discipline in our children. Dr. Spock didn't know anything about African people, and he knew really very little about European people, but he becomes a line that we look for. We can't go and look and find Child Development 101 at the local community college or the major university, depending on what, and go and study that and get certified and say, now I can go out and teach young people. In fact, the matter is that our children reject all those pronouncements about who we are, because instinctually they know, as we really know, that that's not about us, it's not centered in us. It has to be African-centered if it's going to be a model of development. And that's a very formal process. It's not just, let's go out and put on some African clothes and get some drums, start playing some drums, and maybe burn some candles and ring some bells, and we call it Afrocentric. It's not that. It's more complex and more important than those kinds of things. Afrocentric youth development really talks about crafting, and this is where we have to come together as a community, of crafting the systematic process where we develop and stimulate certain kinds of knowledge in our young people, certain kinds of skills in our young people, certain abilities, attitudes, and character in our young people that are necessary for them to have in order to not only survive wherever they find themselves, but to meet the future. And in meeting the future, be able to master that future. Our process of development has to be socially defined, goal-oriented, and designed specifically so that our young people are able to achieve mastery of all and every aspect of human functioning. We can't say we've done a good job if we got brothers who know that when you talk about basketball, that's the black man's thing. That we have failed if we take pride just in the fact that brothers mastered the basketball. Clearly we should master the basketball because that's something that's part of human functioning. But we should see our developmental process as really a process where we achieve mastery of all and every aspect of human functioning. The brother McNair, who was the astronaut, we didn't know, our children didn't know that here's this black man who was an astronaut flying off into space until he met the tragic day of his death. what we should not see and pinpoint him as something to remember because he died. We should remember that McNair was able to play the saxophone in Saul